system then prevailing. But whatever it may, I'll come back to that one if possible. And also I went into the argument of Marx with regard to India. Was he talking about a stagnated agrarian economy, which is obviously mean that there is something called the stagnated, rigid, non-flexible social system that was existing then in India, particularly prior to the 1857, prior to the colonial rule, because you know that after Marx, there's a fundamental, I would call that 1857 as a rupture in Marx's understanding about India. You know, for the first time, he was referring to the British colonial rule and tried to say that the colonial rule was more than a progressive, it was actually a destructive kind of thing, destroying, what's it called, the social systems, which is connected with the economy. For example, like the Indian economy was then the self-sufficient. Indian economy was, surplus economy earlier to the British rule, earlier to the colonial rule. And that economy collapsed, and there were huge and large number of people dying out of hunger, out of distress, and all these things. That was also leading to the larger number of conflict emerging in countryside. Basically, that conflict ultimately converged in the 1857 First War of Independence. I think there are two positions in this particular context. One is the argument of Eric Stokes, who tries to say that it was basically a war of the feudal lords, because the feudal lords had lost
ರಾಜಣ್ಣ ಸರ್ ಕೇಳಿಸ್ತಿದ್ಯಾ?
ಇಲ್ಲ, ಕೇಳಿಸ್ತಾ ಇಲ್ಲ. There is some technical issues.
No problem, sir.
Sir, we can hear you, sir.
ಸತೀಶ್ ಕೇಳಿಸ್ತಿದ್ಯಾ?
ಸರ್ ಕೇಳಿಸ್ತಾ ಇದೆ ರಾಜಣ್ಣ ಸರ್, ಕೇಳಿಸ್ತಾ ಇದೆ ಸರ್.
ಅಲ್ಲ ನೀವು ಮಾತಾಡೋದು ಕೇಳಿಸುತ್ತೆ, ಅವ್ರು ಕೇಳಿಸ್ತಾ ಇಲ್ಲ ಅಂತ.
ರಿಸೋರ್ಸ್ ಪರ್ಸನ್ ಮಾತಾಡೋದು.
ರಿಸೋರ್ಸ್ ಪರ್ಸನ್ ಮಾತಾಡೋದು ಕೇಳಿಸ್ತಾ ಇಲ್ಲ ಸರ್.
ಶಾಂತರ ಸರ್ ಇವಾಗ ಎಸ್ಟಾಬ್ಲಿಷ್ ಆಗ್ತಾ ಇದ್ದಾರೆ.
ಎಸ್ ಸರ್.
ರಿಸೋರ್ಸ್ ಪರ್ಸನ್ ಕಾಣಿಸ್ತಾನೋ ಇಲ್ಲ, ಕೇಳಿಸ್ತಾನೋ ಇಲ್ಲ ಸರ್.
ಅದು 1857 ವಾರ ಅಲ್ವಾ, ಅದಕ್ಕೆ.
ಓ, ಗುರುಸಿದ್ದಯ್ಯ ಸರ್ಗೆ ಹೇಳ್ಬೇಕಾಗಿತ್ತು.
ಈಗ ಕೇಳಿತ್ತಲ್ಲ
ಸರ್, ಈಗ
ಕೇಳ್ತಾ ಇದ್ದು.
ಈಗ ಕೇಳಿಸ್ತಾ ಇದೆ.
ಬಹುಶಃ ನಾನು ಅದು ಎರಿಕ್ ಸ್ಟೋಕ್ಸ್ ನ ಆರ್ಗ್ಯುಮೆಂಟ್ ಇಂದ ಕಂಟಿನ್ಯೂ ಮಾಡ್ತೀನಿ. ಬಹುಶಃ ಎರಿಕ್ ಸ್ಟೋಕ್ ಏನ್ ಹೇಳ್ತಾನಂದ್ರೆ, ಬಹುಶಃ ಕನ್ನಡದಲ್ಲಿ ಮಾತಾಡ್ಲಾ, ಇಂಗ್ಲಿಷ್ ಅಲ್ಲಿ ಮಾತಾಡ್ಲಾ? ಓಕೆ, three participants English ಇದಾರಲ್ಲ. Okay, I'll talk in both the languages.
Thank you, sir.
Look at Eric Stokes' argument.
English al ಮಾಡಿ sir, please.
Okay, let me begin with Eric Stokes' argument or understanding about the 1857. Eric Stokes' argument is simple, but it was very formidable. It's that it was very powerful also. Looking at the 1857 as a war of the feudal lords against the colonial rule. One thing, because most of the people who were involved in the war were largely from the feudal background, had the feudal background. That's the reason why their main agenda was to reclaim their feudal, what's called the lands and other things, and the feudal titles and other things, rather than literally bringing a transformation in agriculture. But at the same time, that's the reason why 1857 is a war of independence one side for Marx, but others it's a war of feudal lords, basically trying to reclaim the lost lands. But the second argument is that the argument of creating a market by the colonial rule and creating a nationalist consciousness, post 1857 as such, as many argues. But the thing is that in that context, one has to ask the question whether the national consciousness began after 1857 or prior to the 1857 as such. There are substantial arguments which try to say that there is a tinge of national consciousness or anti-colonial, which is, many times nationalism was identified with the colonialism, anti-colonialism also. See, if you take the anti-colonialism, then obviously national consciousness was prior to the arrival of the Britishers, or prior to the settlement of the Britishers in Indian context. Taking, some of the examples of the war waged by the Mopillars or the Tangals in the case of the Malabar. Then you have, war by a small principality in Karnataka in the coastal belt called Rani Abbakka, and there's one more queen in the North Canara and other things. So that's the reason this argument was made. But the thing is that let me get into the how colonialism, transformed the Indian society. I think I need to take into account three important factors in this context, even or possibly the fourth one, because the fourth one has not been debated much in Indian context, particularly looking at the Muslims society. Did they, one question one can ask, did it bring any transformation, or did it document some of the transformation taking place among the Muslims in Indian context? Why I'm trying to bring it here is that you have a parallel argument between the caste system in Indian context and the Muslim caste on the other. Both have been seen as a parallel process in Indian context. But at the same time, we need to understand the changes that the agrarian economy underwent during the colonial period, and what are the kind of transformation that has taken place. Let me begin with a certain arguments. Let me take up the argument about the caste in Indian context. Did Britishers, one of the arguments is that which actually I brought up before in the last time. Did Britishers were responsible for the construction of the caste in Indian context? Were they the first one to construct the caste, or what is called the jati? In fact, there's a difference between the jati and the caste. Caste is, colonial construction, and the jati is much earlier in Indian context, which prevailed much earlier. That's the reason I'm trying to give. I gave the documents of Megasthenes and others, other than the religious text. We have got other texts, popular text. And the second argument is that the Britishers created more and more caste. How did they create? I mean, this is the second argument. I'll come back to that later on. And the third was the Britishers also provided identities to the caste. That was the third. The fourth one is that did they transplanted theories of caste to understand the Indian society as such? Did they invented new theories about the caste? even though I'm not a sociologist, but my readings about the caste with regard to the agrarian societies in India, makes me to get into the issues about the caste in Indian context. One of the fundamental argument is that the Britishers constructed new caste in Indian context. So that's the reason why Indian society was full of caste. That you cannot think about Indian society without caste. That's one thing. Or Indian, there's society is completely identified with the caste because that caste having this hierarchy, social distancing, and other things as the principles. But the thing is that one argument that the Britishers could able to create large number of castes, was it true or is it wrong? This question we need to understand. What if that is the case? What is the kind of politics that the caste played in due course? That's the most important. One of the argument, as I said earlier, that they created new caste. Okay, caste is created in the colonial period. See, they could be able to create through using many mechanisms. Colonialism used different methods. They used different techniques. They used a different methodology to understand the caste. One is that they used the different methodologies to understand the Indian caste. One is that they went into the historicity of the caste. Initially they went into the religious text to understand the popular understanding about the caste. Like, for example, they went into the history, or probably they derived from the Manu Dharma Shastra, and which William Jones translated, and tried to understand the caste and its linkage with the religious text, religious understanding about the caste. For example, Brahmins from the, there are four kinds of argument, four jatis that they identified. But interestingly, their writings, the colonial writings, probably initially, there are two things that's quite apparent. One is that they try to bring in what's called the racial theory. In India's, and try to see the linkage between the race and the caste in the Indian context. They belong to the Aryan race. I said earlier how they constructed this Aryan race with the William Jones argument about saying that Sanskrit and Persian languages are not indigenous in nature, but rather it is basically from the Persian world. So they try to identify the origin of these languages and the people who were speaking these particular languages as from the languages from the other parts of the world. That's one thing. The second is that they try to identify the four structures in terms of the race. For example, like if I'm right, Aim Shah and not Andre Bacheli and others, they are sociologists who try to understand, try to equate this caste with the race. But the Britishers, I believe, colonialists did not carry forward this racial theory because they need to give it up, this racial argument in between. Because that they went on to develop their own theory about the caste in Indian context. That for example, before that one, they tried to understand the caste in terms of the anthropometrics way also. For example, Roussel, one of the anthropologists, ethnographer, he tries to understand the caste in terms of what's called the body sizes and the colors. So you would get into the issues about the size of the nose, the color of the body, and the size of the body and other things, and tries to divide the categories in Indian context, I think in terms of the 7 forms. Sometimes you would say that they are not only the Aryans, but also Indo-Aryan, Dravidians, Turco-Indian, something. I mean, you create many categories of population in Indian context, But at the same time, if you look at the colonial writings, in fact, we need to refer to different kinds of writings. One is the census report, most important census report, which try to create a caste category, which try to understand the caste category. But the thing is that census reports are basically about the numbering of the caste, rather than deep explanation about the caste. Probably in 1 or 2 census, one can find the, for example, in 1931, British colonial, census gives us a detailed description about the caste in Indian context. Even 1901 Bengal census also, it gives the detailed description about the caste. And I think 1869 Out census also gives us the details about the caste. The most important thing is that caste census becomes important because it's not a simple numbering. Caste enumeration, which began in 1871 proper. Earlier, there are attempts to count the numbers of people. For example, 1869 in Oudh province, or in I think 1850 somewhere in Madras also they did it. In other parts also they did it, but they were all haphazard, counting the numbers. I would say that 1869 is the beginning of counting the numbers. Numbers of the caste, counting the people in terms of their caste identities or in terms of their caste. Even though earlier also they did it. I think 1830 also they did it. They mentioned about the prevalence of the caste in Indian context. But the actual counting started after 1871 census. Even it also started in Karnataka, even though in 1871, the then Mysore, the province was under the British rule up till 1881, I think. Between 1831 and 1881, Karnataka was under, the Mysore was under the British rule, the colonial rule. Despite all these things, colonialism started counting the numbers. That's one thing. Why did it count the numbers? What was the major argument that was brought in here? Counting the numbers was essential for the colonialists. If you read that one, if you read carefully the census reports, because it would provide them the record information. That's what their argument. Let me take their argument about the census reports. Their argument was that it would provide them the sufficient information with regard to the people, their economic condition, their social conditions, and their employment, their representation in the different sectors, land and the farmers and other, land and the caste and other things. This was basically about the information that it would provide them. But in fact, on the contrary, there are other arguments also. The arguments is that it was nothing but this huge amount of material. Remember, the material of census report was so huge that they were sometime in 1920 or 11 onwards, they started thinking in terms of giving up the caste enumeration in Indian context, because they thought one is that it was too much, too bulky, and it was draining their resources also. It was cumbersome carrying the enumeration details from one place to the another. For example, like the Coorg district enumeration, it was counted in Bangalore. Even if they want to find out, cross verify any mistake that is caused in during the enumeration, they had to go back to the Coorg. It was not easy carrying back to the enumeration, census back to the Coorg and counting the numbers. Or it is not only there were times when they lost the statistics also, numbers also. In that case, how to reproduce the numbers, that becomes a very problematic for them. These are that's the reason why what they did, and also there are other problems also. One of the problems is that how to count the numbers of the tables, and in that case, how to identify, how to categorize these tables in the context of the enumeration. It becomes very difficult because there are times where they were not able to penetrate deep into. So, for example, like the Andaman Nicobar, there were tribals who will not allow enumerators to get in, and it was so difficult for the enumerators to to enter into the forest, deep forest. And that's the reason why the colonialists sometimes could not able to come out with the exact number. Rather, they went by what is called the estimate of the caste categories, and particularly the tribals. So you have this estimate about the tribals rather than the exact number. And most important thing is that they when they were employing huge stress structure, particularly government servants and others, there were many problems that they faced. One is that many government servants who were reluctant to go to the countryside and count the numbers. Interestingly, in the initial times, particularly in 1871 and 1881, when they are counting, the enumeration began on a particular day, and that too after night. And this was also decided when there is no festivals, no marriages, and other things happening. Mainly because that they knew very well that if this happens, they will not get the numbers. They wanted to be very, very accurate in this particular context, but they were not. They were not accurate in terms of counting the numbers of the caste, in terms of the number of people who belong to different castes and the subcaste. And interestingly, they initially counted the numbers, or they gave a colored what's called the slip to the caste or the religion or the communities. For example, while counting the numbers of the Muslims, they gave the green slip. They thought that green is identified with the Muslims, so they gave that one. That was a hilarious kind of thing. But the thing is that two things we need to understand. One is that the wrong entry of the caste while enumerating. So that's the reason why a small mistake committed in the enumeration created spaces for new caste to emerge, new caste to be documented. I'll tell you about one small mistake. That was very, very apparent in a 1931 census report. A caste known as Mir. While documenting this caste, Mir caste, the enumerator, what he did, he put a dot in different, place, I think, that because, he was counting that the enumeration was done in the Urdu language, something of that kind. The dot a small dot changed the caste identity. A Hindu Mir became a Muslim Mir. That's one thing. And that's the reason why there are times when caste identification becomes blurred one. There is a kind of ambiguity in understanding the caste Indian context. The second is that there are caste prejudice among the, what's it called, the enumerator. If an enumerator belongs to the upper caste, he would desist to, or he will not take any interest in, enumerating these castes, particularly backward caste and other caste. Or you try to see that the caste belongs to, he belongs to the same caste, or his caste is reflected. Third, while documenting the caste, there's a gap between what people said and what, the name entered into in the enumeration. So there is a huge gap. For example, they have not been, for example, in the case of Kallar Jati, when they go to houses, one thing, they would ask invariably, what would be your caste? The people at home, particularly women folk, they would say that we don't know anything about the caste. Then obviously they'll ask, what would be your profession? The people at home, they would say that, lifting, or we are all thieves and all these things. These are, and this becomes, they would say that, suppose if they say that we are Kallar, Chor, like for example, the Ganti Chora, or it becomes a caste itself by itself, professionalism or family work, that becomes a caste itself. So they created this kind of caste. In the process, what happened is that you have got a huge number of castes emerging in Indian context. The third most important thing is that while they were enumerating, the caste which are operating in one side might be said that, operating or existing or listed as one caste, it's completely different in other region. Then it becomes very difficult. Even though they practice the similar, values and the principles and other things. That's the reason why it becomes very, very difficult to enumerate the caste. And also there's one more important thing we need to understand. Like while counting the population, it becomes very difficult to identify or to divide this caste or to put this one particular caste under one religion. Now, this was a problematic in the case of the Lingayas in Karnataka. Where do you put them? How do you call them? Can you call them as a separate religion? Or is it possible to call them as a separate a religion with a different caste? That is the interesting thing. They did not have any clear-cut understanding about the Lingayat. Even though they said that it's a sect, there are times when they say that sect, and they were, finding it extremely difficult to document sect under religion, sect as caste. For example, how do you document Kabir Panthis? Kabir Panthis are either the Muslims or Hindus, they belong to both the communities. How do you document them? Can you document as, the Hindus, or can you document as Muslims? This becomes a problematic. Like even it's a case with the Chaitanya followers. Some of the Chaitanya followers are the Muslims. And there are many sects, where you find them, where you bring them. This become a problematic in the case of the syncretic culture. For example, like there are arguments saying that for the first time, the Britishers came out with this argument, and they documented invariably the large number of Muslims who had the background of the Hinduism. You know, they profess the same, they had the similar occupation. At the same time, they had the similar history, but they belong to the two different religions. Either they are Muslims or the Hindus, or when they were converting, for example, large number of when Jats converted, they retained their social practices of pre-conversion period. In that particular context, how do you understand them? I'll come back to the argument of criminal traps or the criminal caste also. How do you understand this particular caste? Or take the case of the Meos. So the Mewatis. Meos are a caste groups in the present day Haryana, spread across Haryana, Punjab, Rajasthan. Interestingly, they would say that they are all Muslims, but their family god is Krishna. Krishna, how do you, in that case, where do you locate them? Is it possible to locate them under Hinduism or under Islam? That becomes a problematic. This is not only a problem, but even if I go back to this is the problematic in the colonial understanding about the caste. But this problem, started much earlier. For example, Harbans Mukhi argues one of his argument during the medieval period, large number of Hindus got converted to the Islam, and there was a reconversion process also, which he says that the reconversion to Hinduism in the absence of the Shuddhi movement or in the absence of the Arya Samaja movement then itself, even though there are attempts by the Jesuit during the medieval period to convert large number of Muslims to Christianity and other things, whatever it may be. Here, one problem the Britishers confronted was that, is it possible to identify the caste among the Muslims? Even though caste is considered to be the major component in the Hinduism, they understood, and at the same time, they came out with the new theories of the caste. It's not the racial theory alone. A racial theory was discarded later on because it was not fitting into the Indian context. It was different, and that's the reason why the racial theory was, adopted in the by the Spaniards in the context of the Latin America, where they try to understand the caste with the race. Like, for example, Carter Wilson in the context of the American United States tries to understand the caste as race, caste equivalent to race kind of thing, because racial theory was very much apparent, particularly while arguing about the Jim Crow movement in the context of the United States. But in the context of India, they gave up this racial theory, but they came out with the different theories. I think they came out with the 7 theories about the caste formation in Indian context, even though they began with the earliest theories was, basically focusing on the the spiritual or the religious text. But as they went on investigating, the investigation was done through a couple of methods. One was the method of census report, counting the numbers. What would you consider? I'll tell you about that. The second was coming out with the gazetteer. Third most important was the ethnographic studies, which I'll come back to that one. The study of Russell, Hutton, and others, Risley, and others working on the caste and try to understand the caste in Indian context. But the thing is that in the context of the Muslims, they confronted this problem, the problem of identifying or documenting the caste among the Muslims. Is there something called the caste? How this caste is different from the Hindu caste system? Hindu caste system is known for its rigidity. Hindu caste system is known for its non-flexibility, or it is known for the hierarchy and also social distancing. Caste is also known for the sub-caste identities. They would say that they would identify large number of sub-caste among the different castes. For example, with the Brahmins, for example, like they would identify not less than, in the case of the Brahmins, I think in the 1871 census report in Karnataka, they identified, old Mysore, they identified not less than 40 to 50 subcaste, whether it's Smarta Brahmin or different kind of Brahmins, they identified with that one. Even they identified among the Kurubas, if I'm right, there were nearly 14 subcaste. 14 subcaste. Can you imagine that? When, for example, like the Betta Kurubas, these other Kurubas, Kadu Kurubas, Nada Kurubas, or other Kambali Kurubas, Nada Kurubas, and other Kurubas they identified. And there were some names, which disappeared later on. This is the case with the Muslims also. Look at while analyzing the Muslims, they came out with certain arguments. For example, 1901 census report of the Bengal, or 1869 report of the Oudh, or the case of the Bombay, Karnataka, census reports of 1901, 1911, 1921, and 1931. They all came out with the argument that there were a similar there were castes among the Muslims which are almost reflecting the caste system that was operating in Hindu system. But there are certain differences. One difference is that the difference is about the flexibility. The flexibility is that even though they went on to the same theory, initially there was an instance, there's a reference wherein they would say that caste is also, among the Muslim, caste is also Western import. For example, Middle Eastern import. They would argue that the four caste among the Muslim, the upper caste among the Muslim, Sheikh, Said, Pathan, and there's one more, Mughals, they not only came from the Middle East or the Persian or other parts of the world, they also brought in the caste system. They brought in the caste experience in India and created the similar kind of the caste system in Indian context, which is nothing but close to the arguing, similar to that of the Aryan invasion kind of thing. Except the argument of the invasion, here the argument of the arrival was brought in. That's the difference. The second important thing is that they would say that there's a similarity between Hindu caste system and the Muslim caste system, except certain things. One is that anybody who is converted from the lower caste can keep the names of upper caste. For example, Dadekula. Dadekula is a Dalit, or Dalekula is an untouchable in two places in Karnataka. For example, like the Bellari, and you find this reference to Dadekulas in Kurg. Kurg 1871 census would argue about that one. And the manual of Bellari also refers to the Dadekulas. Dadekulas were untouchables who are also known as halal kors. In fact, the name was given by Akbar to this caste. And these Dadekulas were, when they were converting, or when they were converting into Islam from Hindu caste, and they can keep the names of the upper caste. Like, for example, Sheikh. This is also argued in the context of the Gwalior, census also. It says that any person who gets converted by virtue of his connections and by virtue of his what's called the money power, capacity, economic power, he can claim the ladder, he can claim the tag of a Sayyid, which is nothing but the upper caste. At the same time, he can claim the tag of Mughal or even Sheikh. So that kind of flexibility is allowed. And that's the reason why you don't get the pure category among the Muslims. You have the hybrid category. One is, he might be, if you look at his, for example, the Sheikhs, you might have two, if you look at their background, either they are the Arab stock or they are the, local stock. This is a case in the context of the Labbais. And they also went into the debates on hybridity of the caste. How, the caste have been created by the interaction or social interaction between the local population and the newly arrived category. That's the reason why you have got the Indo-Dravidian category that was adopted in an Indian context. At the same time, you have this hybridity of the communities, like for example, Mopillas. Mopillas were the hybrid product of Arab traders who came to Malabar, settled down there long back, before the arrival of the British and even after that one, and particularly after Portuguese came, and married to the local population. So you have this hybridity happening, and that's the reason why you have got a category called the Mopillas. That's one thing. Similar as case in Karnataka, you have got the Navayats. Navayats in the Bhatkal area, they also belong to this hybridity. Their forefathers were the Arab traders. They married to the Jains here, local Jains, and you have got a category called the Navayats. Similar was the case with the Labbais in the Tamil Nadu. There are, conversion took place from different religion as such. For example, Jainism to the Islam and other things. What I'm trying to say that the caste is not an exclusive phenomenon of the Hinduism, not Hindu social structure. This is mainly because, this caste identities or the caste values also spread across to the other religion who got converted due to different reasons, whether it's the forcible or it was by this, Sufi saints, or is it because of the economic interest or to retain the property. I told you about, interestingly in 1857, one person would associate with the Britishers from a family and other would be remain as a Muslim, because in the event, 1857 war becomes, if it is defeated, they'll not lose anything. If they won the battle, they'll not lose anything. So that's the reason why they would try to see the similarity between these two social systems, Hindu social system and the Muslim social system. But at the same time, the Britishers came out with the 7 theories of caste in Indian context. That's a strange thing. Most of the time they brought this idea from the Western world. For example, even in the context of the agrarian thing, for example, when Thomas Munro introduced what's called the Raitwari system in the agriculture, probably he brought the idea of the Raitwari system from utilitarian theory, then dominating the European context. See, look at here the 7 theories. One is the theory of migration, the theory of interaction between different caste and other communities. This is most important because why I'm trying to bring it, this particular argument is that a social structure composed of the one particular community ultimately expanded by virtue of the fact that the other community also adopted the similar values. Let me argue about the one particular ethnic groups. For example, in the context of the tribals, what happened was that one theory was that tribals, even though Britishers had absolutely no clear-cut understanding about these ethnic groups or indigenous group or the tribal groups, but so that's the reason that they would call these tribals as what is called animist. Sometimes they would call as categorize, conceptualize them as animist. Animist is one who believes in higher spirit, believes in the spirit, believes in the fire, believes in the nature. They're a nature worshipper, the fire worshipper, or the spirit worshipper, and other things. And they had no clear-cut understanding about the religion or caste and other things. So that's the reason why they were called the animist. Most of the time, the tribals in Karnataka, including the Indian context, they were called, branded as animist or as junglis or as forest dwellers. Another thing, that's the reason why there was no clear-cut understanding about them. But one theory that was adopted, that's the reason why you need to bring back the argument of M.S. Srinivas here. The argument is about the long interaction of the tribals, particularly in the plain areas after settling down in one particular locality. What happened was that they started interacting with the non-tribal communities. They were either working as tenant of the landlords, or they were having the long interaction. What happened in the process was that given the long-term interaction, they adopted the Hindu culture. So the tribals became Hindus in the annals of the British. There are two things. Let me tell you about that. One is how the number, while counting their numbers in the census reports, how the tribals were merged with the Hindus as a category. That's the reason why number of the Hindus swelled, increased, substantially increased at the cost of the tribals. Even though tribals retained their identities, but they were treated as a part of Hindus, unlike Kabir Panthis and others. Second was, they came out with new theory, because I would like to bring that theory argument, because that is having some influence, or somewhere it has some effect in the understanding about the M.S. Srinivas. The tribals, that ethnic groups, in the process of interaction, they try to claim the status of Kshatriyas. They try to claim the status of the ruling class, even though they ruled in some of the places. That was not a problem. That was not an issue. But given their long interaction, they wanted to project themselves as martial class. They wanted to project themselves as the Kshatriyas. So they imbibed this kind of values. They believed that they belong to these communities, Kshatriya communities, or they also believed that they were linked to these Rajput clans of the caste. So this process of what's called emulating, or this process of identifying with the Kshatriyas or the Rajput, is called as Rajputization, or it is also called the Kshatriyization. Remember, this is done by the Ethnographic Studies. This was Ethnographic Studies would say, and most important, this is not only that, but also the census report. Ethnographic studies, for example, like Ristley or Enthovan or Hutton kind of argument, or in Karnataka, you are getting Nanyude and others. They are trying to getting into the how the caste formed, how the caste has, I mean, carried the memories of their history, how they tried to claim the superiority of their caste. For example, they are trying to refer themselves as the Surya Vamshis or Chandra Vamshis and others, even the lowest caste. One important thing about the enumeration is that enumeration did not leave a single person belong to a specific caste. Even the number is 1, the enumeration would not desist in enumerating them. That's the reason why in the enumeration, in the census report, you got even the microscopic caste being enumerated. But their social practice are clearly defined or clearly, explained by the ethnographic studies. Remember, because census report give the numbers, caste numbers, caste identities. That led to what is called the binary oppositions. For example, it created the opposition called the minority caste and the majority caste, forward caste and the backward caste. Or it also creates a category called the depressed caste. Interestingly, it also created colonial reading, also created the category called criminal caste, particularly migrating caste. Particularly caste which are migrating from one place to the another. Most of the time, they were branded as the criminal caste by the state. Interestingly, theory to understand that caste, a criminal caste, was borrowed from the Western understanding, European understanding. They got an understanding saying that anybody who does the criminal activities like killing, murdering, looting, and other. For example, you got Pindaris. You might be knowing about the history of the Pindaris, who are later on became a caste, Pindari caste. Pindari caste was basically dacoits. They were the dacoits, and they were, treated as a criminal tribes, criminal caste. Or you got Chappar Bandis in Karnataka. You got the Chappar Bandis, who had the history of minting counterfeit coins, and these castes, Chappar Bandis, were treated as the criminal caste in Indian context and in the Karnataka context also. So Britishers constructed different varieties of caste. I look at in the context of the criminal caste, they borrowed the idea from the Western world, particularly saying that any person who is involved in the dacoity and other things represent the whole community. So mistake committed by one person was applied to the whole community itself. Whole community was branded as the criminal tribe and criminal caste. And that's the reason why you have got this kind of understanding about the caste. But in the context of the tribes, as an ethnic groups, their understanding is that they're animist. So construction of their community as an animist society. It also created them as junglis. But at the same time, they understood the process of Kshatriyization and Rajputization that is taking place, which is parallel to the argument of M.N. Srinivas, who used the concept called the Samskritization. So you got two kinds of readings of two or multiple kinds of readings by the colonialist. One is the census reports, understanding the Indian society in terms of the numbers, in terms of the binary oppositions, in terms of the historicity, all these things. Now, on the other hand, you have got the what's called the ethnographic studies conducted throughout India, whether it's in Punjab or it's in the Oudh or West Bengal, Karnataka, Bombay Presidency area, Madras Presidency area, and other places. And each ethnographic studies, even though there were many ambiguities, because their understanding about the caste was not completely correct. They had their own problem of understanding. But whatever it may be, they tried to document. They tried to document those castes which are not being documented earlier. So they, otherwise what happened that if the colonialism had not documented, probably caste would not have got its identity. That we need to understand. If they are not documented or create, even though in history they have created many castes by the mistake of while writing, they created many castes by virtue of the mistakes by the enumerator. That I would call it as a mistake of the colonialism. They created, they constructed, they reproduced. But that doesn't mean that caste identities were stagnant during the colonial period. Remember, every enumeration would bring large number of castes, not only to represent, but also declare themselves as different caste. So there are attempts. This is apparent in the context of the Jammu and Kashmir census report. This is apparent in the context of the Karnataka. If you read the census report of 1911, 1921, and 1901, wherein different castes, nearly, I would say that in Karnataka, nearly 50 castes. For example, one example I would give that, there is a caste among Vakkaligas, which would say that we are not the Vakkaligas, Kunchitigas, if I'm right, they would say that we are not the Vakkaligas, we should be treated as separate caste. There are many castes in Kashmir, they wanted to be identified with the Brahmins. Okay. There are many castes, they would say that no, we are not with the Brahmins, we need to be given the status of a, Rajputs. So the caste identity, there were times when the caste identities underwent changes between one enumeration, one census report to another census report. So that's the reason why caste, while bringing an identity to the caste for the first time, which has not been given earlier, because earlier, prior to the colonial period, you had only 4 castes, officially recognized by the scriptures, and it did not recognize the presence of thousands of castes. For example, in the context of the Madras presidency, British colonialists identified not less than 1,250 castes. Bombay presidency equal number, you can't find it in the context of the Bombay presidency. That's the reason I'm trying to say that they identified, they recognized the caste, they identified the caste, they recognized the caste, they documented the caste, they also created the caste. They also provided the identity to the caste. So Indian society is vibrant with the caste. So without understanding caste, you cannot understand the Indian society. How the caste were, divided in terms of their social practices, how caste were, looked upon on the basis of their, social status, how the caste were, treated in the social structure, and at the same time, most important is how the caste got, while converting into the different religion, whether the Christianity or the Islam, how they retain their social practices, social values. In the process, how they created what is called the hybridity of the religion, hybridity of the caste. They are neither Muslims nor Christians nor Hindus. They are neither Christians nor Hindus. This kind of hybridity that they created, and that's the reason why our social system also had this hybridity. And at the same time, it created a problematic of identifying, defining their boundaries, defining their clear-cut identities or markers and other things. So you have got this problem that created. And now the question is that, while one side they created ethnic groups, tribes, they created caste categories, both among the Muslims and the Christians. Did they create the same thing, similar thing with the peasantry? Agrarian economy. How do you look at this agrarian economy? See, probably first time after the colonial rule, agrarian economy underwent complete change. It created probably the multiple, categories of peasantry. We don't use a term called the farmers in the while analyzing the colonial period, because we never had the market economy developing. The British never developed this, market economy, even though they introduced some amount of capitalism, which was specific to certain regions, which was specific to certain provinces, but capitalism was not dominating factor. Mainly because the colonial interest was completely different. They had no interest in transformation of India. They had the interest of looting India, exploiting India, appropriating India, or draining India. Like, for example, this is quite obvious in the argument of Dada by Navroji, who came out of the argument of drain theory. Or if you read Marx's arguments also, it is quite obvious that the Britishers were concerned about draining India. And this draining was meant to create or reproduce capitalism in the context of the colonial period. For example, they introduced a certain amount of, as I said, capitalist relations in the indigo cultivation, or they introduced, American cotton in the context of the what's that called, the Dharwad and other region. This way, this cotton or indigo or jute, others, they were developed in India, not for the reason of Indians, for rural, for the Indian consumption, but for the Manchester state, to develop the industrial growth, or to have the industrial growth in the context of the United Kingdom. So India became a dependent economy, one side. In fact, there are three phases in the colonial rule Indian context. One is the mercantile period. The second was the the second was the industrial period. Third was the finance capital period. Look at this period, these three periods, one needs to understand that. So, for example, economists like RP differentiate this kind of thing. And at the same time, they introduced three, what's called the structures in agriculture. One is the Raitwari system, the second was the Zamindari system, and the third was the Malwari. Raitwari system was, meant to extract rents, meant to extract the revenues from the big landlords. It's a landlordism that they introduced. But unfortunately, it created a huge structure of landlords, or what is called the feudal structures in Indian context. Zamindari system was supposed to create what's called the direct relation between the peasantry and the state. But unfortunately, it also created layers of social structures. It also created feudal structures, layers of feudal structures in Indian context. And that's the reason why peasantry, which was said, that they were exploited not by immediate landlords, but by the layers of landlords. Between the first landlord and the last landlord, there were nearly 36 layers. So in that context, the colonial, that's the reason why the peasantry was exploited by the 36 layers of the feudal lords. Whatever it is. Here, one side, the peasantry that they created, they were absolutely exploited. Once, and also they were, their economy became unproductive. There is something called the underdevelopment that is taking place in the context of the agriculture. Does it mean, or at the same time, this was transplanted to in the context of the tribal areas? New and new categories of people entered into the tribal areas, and they were also exploited. Their lands were confiscated. Their lands were alienated. Similar case with the peasantry. And what will be the consequence? Why I'm trying to say that, look at a social structure, a social system that was created was largely treated as passive, or was largely created as an uneconomical or backward. But here is a social structure or the social system, countering or trying to oppose the British rule. And look at the kind of argument that Ranjit Gua and others they made with regard to the subaltern consciousness. For the first time in Indian history, the Indian historians, they came out of the argument of identifying